WestJet Pilots and other podcast listeners, and welcome to this edition 28 of PIREP, the WestJet Pilots podcast. My name is Captain Desmond Jordan. I am here joining the sound booth today, as usual, by the Wizard of Sound, Captain Chris Von Jones. And also today we have our guest, Captain Francis Hane, our merger committee chairman. How are you today, Francis?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Des. It has been a difficult time for our Alpa family. Everything that's gone on in the last month with regards to Christina. I should mention a few words. You and CVJ, we were at the memorial yesterday, and you guys did an absolutely fantastic job that duly honored, a first-class aviator, a dear friend, and just a remarkable woman. I've been involved in the Alpa, volunteering for Alpa for a number of years, and one of the interesting things about volunteering for Alpa is you get to see the nuts and bolts and the gears and how everything works at Alpa. And my background is primarily in negotiating, and often as a negotiator, we just went through this CA2 negotiation that turned out to be quite successful. And there's often a misconception that Alpa is driven by a few really brilliant people, and as good as the negotiators that we have are, and Andrew Hamber and Joel and Tracy. That's not what makes Alpa. It's every line pilot that showed up to a picket. It's every line pilot that was willing to take a stand for this profession. And it is people like Christina who organize all the line pilots and get that unity. Often we think about, let's say, that a negotiator would have some sort of special toolkit and bring something up. And that's not what makes a good contract. What makes a good contract is when the company is looking at the negotiator and they see 2,000 pilots in unity behind them. And that is the reason for our success. And Christina was a driving force in making sure that everyone was rowing in the same direction. So I think it behooves us to begin our podcast in memory of Christina. And a thank you to all the people, the unsung heroes of Alpa, that spend their time selflessly volunteering for the advancement of this profession.
Very well said, Francis. I couldn't agree with you more. We just finished up with the memorial yesterday, and I will say on behalf of all the people that were involved, it was our honor and an unfortunate pleasure to be able to send off our dear friend Christina in the manner that we did. Hey, just as a reminder, out there it's tail 325. For those of you who don't know, they did dedicate an aircraft to Captain Christina Thompson. It's tail 325, one of our new Maxes. So if you're out there and you see it, take a picture and send it out to hashtag 325.
That's excellent. That was a very welcome gesture, and I think it went a long way for our pilot group.
Absolutely. Well, let's get down to the brass tacks, my friend.
Certainly.
It's early in 2024. We're into and living under our present contract. I think people are relatively happy with it. The thing that I think that's on people's minds now is your committee's task, and that's merger.
Yeah, that's right. And so last podcast that I did, one of the key messages I said is, hey guys, the merger hasn't even started. Nothing's been filed yet. We're just getting all prepared. Not only has the merger started now, Des, it's come at us with a vengeance. There has been so much activity in the last month. There was supposed to be a fast read that came out a bit less than a month ago, and then unfortunately with everything that happened with Christina, that got put on the back burner. But I'd like you to walk you through what's happened in the last month.
Mr. Chelmer, please tell us how it's going.
Certainly. So, as you know, in LOU 20, the company or Alpa is responsible for filing an application with the Canadian Industrial Relations Board, the CIRB. And commonly we call this a single employer application. There was a sale of a business, obviously, that Sunwing was purchased by WestJet. And so this application is technically called a sale of business application. That was filed by Alpa in the second week of December. And the basic thrust of that application is, hey, there's been a sale of the business. WestJet is planning to integrate two groups. They are represented by different unions with different collective agreements. And those collective agreements and those seniority lists have to be integrated in order for there to be an integrated flight deck, to be an integrated operation. That happened the second week of December, and that was filed by Alpa National. It was not filed by our MEC. It was filed by our Alpa, who holds the bargaining rights for us. What that means is that we have filed an application to intervene. So when the board hears arguments, they will listen to an argument that we have. Because as I explained previously, Alpa has taken an approach that eventually the Sunwing Pilots will be represented by Alpa, and Alpa is going to be a neutral party to this. So we have applied for that intervener status, and we have yet to hear back from the board.
Can you explain how the agreement in our collective agreement where Alpa is supposed to be the successor bargaining unit, how that pertains to this situation?
Yes. So it's pretty clear to everybody, WestJet, Unifor, and WestJet, and WestJet Alpa, that the Alpa will be the successor bargaining agent. If this were to come down to a vote, which I don't think it will, but if it were, we do expect that Alpa would be the successor bargaining agent, not Unifor. And in our collective agreement, if Alpa is the successor bargaining agent, it would be our collective agreement that would remain in force. So getting back to the intervener, people might be asking, what is an intervener? An intervener is a party that has an interest and is allowed to make submissions to the board. An intervener does not duplicate. Like, we would not say something that Alpa has already said. What we're saying is just if there is something that we want to add, that Alpa would hear that as well.
So just to clarify, Alpa, the organization, because they have the rights to the union, have filed for status to merge these two groups. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And WestJet Alpa, our pilot group, being a member of Alpa, is an intervener in this situation. So it's not WestJet Alpa that's filing this. It's Alpa, the broader association, from a legal perspective, that has to file it.
Yes.
And where we fall in that umbrella as WestJet, the WestJet Alpa bargaining unit, we are the intervener in that filing. That
is correct. And so there's been a number of other parties that have come forward that have asked for intervener status. The first one is Encore. They have grandfather rights under the PTA, the Pilot Transfer Agreement, so we expect that. The flight attendants, QP, for both WestJet and for Sunwing, have also filed for intervener status because they'd like to have their voices heard if need be. Now, this might seem like a lot of parties, but keep in mind, in the Air Canada-Canadian merger, there were 23 interveners. Every group, it was dispatchers, it was AMEs, it was flight attendants, it was CSAs. Every group from every airline intervened in that matter. So that brings me now to Sunwing. So Sunwing has just filed an application or filed a response to the CIRB, to this application. And so what they are asking for is they not only want to be an intervener, they also want to be a party. So they want to have the right to bring their own evidence, bring their own submissions, and be their own standalone party before this. And to be honest, we are okay with that. I mean, if they want to be a party or they want to be an intervener, it doesn't really make much substantive difference to us. It's more semantics. But there is something else that is important in Sunwing's filing as well. Sunwing has also opposed our status as an intervener. They do not feel that we need to have a voice independently from Alpa because we already have Alpa.
So you said that Sunwing has filed to block our application as an intervener. Why would they do that? Well,
there's a number of reasons. One of them, we can just look at their filing. They have said it would unduly complicate the proceedings. If we're given the liberty to read into that a bit more, it could very well be that they think, hey, Alpa's already involved in this. We don't need to have two parties ganging up on us. We just want to deal with one of those parties. The truth of it is, it is a bit of a surprising application. And the reason I find it surprising is because, we threw out an olive branch to the MEC from Sunwing. And in our filing, we explicitly said that Sunwing should be allowed to intervene. And now for them to come back and say, well, we don't want them to intervene, it did catch us by surprise. However, either way the CIRB decides whether we can be an intervener or we can't be an intervener, it really is of little consequence to us. And here I'll explain why. If we are successful in being an intervener, then we get a full voice. If the CIRB says, no, you're already represented by ALPA, you don't need an additional voice, ALPA will represent you. And recall that ALPA has said they take a hands-off approach, and that is the advice that ALPA's lawyers have given ALPA, and we respect that. But let's just say the CIRB, this is the adjudicative body, says, no, you owe a duty of representation to the WestJet Pilots. Well, ALPA will no longer be taking a hands-off approach to this. ALPA will take a very active and vigorous advocacy approach. We still have our own lawyer. ALPA has their lawyer, and we will be in a position where it won't be ALPA National providing instructions to the lawyer. It will be us driving the process. And if that happens, that's okay. But you have to look at the unintended consequences. You now have the world's largest pilot union advocating on your behalf and taking an adversarial role against a union who really has no experience in aviation mergers and very little experience in aviation generally.
Just to clarify, what are the advantages of being a party as opposed to, say, being an intervener?
Good question. So a party typically has full status in the proceedings. They can call evidence, they can cross-examine witnesses, and they can do submissions. For interveners, it depends on what the role of that intervener is as assigned by, let's say, the CIRB. You could have an intervener that can only make submissions but cannot call evidence, or an intervener that can only cross-examine witness and call evidence. But in many cases, in this one, we would expect that if we are an intervener and Sunwing was an intervener, we'd have a full intervener status where we can call evidence, cross-examine witnesses, and make submissions that don't overlap with the submissions made by the parties, namely ALPA and WestJet.
So it sounds like the operations behind the scenes on this merger process are somewhat complicated. Can we bring this back down to kind of a meat and potatoes level? Basically, in your mind, how are things going with this merger?
I think they are going on track.
Okay.
The company has set a deadline. They want to have this completed by October 2024. We are absolutely committed to meeting that target, but there's a number of things that need to happen to meet that target.
Like what?
So the closest to that, the last thing that happens is the seniority list integration. We expect those negotiations to start during the summer and potential mediation and arbitration towards the late summer and early fall. Before the seniority list integration happens, there needs to be a protocol agreement signed. And
is that the TPA, Transition Protocol Agreement?
No, that's a transition process agreement.
Okay, that's different.
Yeah, protocol agreement is the agreement that gives the framework for the seniority list integration. There is also the transition process agreement, which is currently being negotiated between our negotiating team, WestJet, and Sunwing Unifor. So it's a three-way agreement. And it is an agreement that sets out how the Sunwing pilots will be integrated into the WestJet operation. So things like what kind of vacation do they get? What kind of sick bank will they get? When will they actually start flying with other WestJet pilots?
And how is that portion going? Is that moving along?
So we have quite a bit of common ground with the Sunwing pilots on a lot of those items. We have some common ground with the company on those items, and then we of course have differences with Sunwing on some items and differences with the company on some items. So I'll just lead you through some of the common ground that we have. So for example, with Sunwing, their biggest thing is they want to stay with Unifor until the conclusion of this process. And so our MEC has agreed to that. We've come to an agreement that they can stay with Unifor until the end of the process. And then in exchange, Sunwing will support the application before the CIRB.
What if they don't support that application?
Well, then we would have to reevaluate. So obviously, if they break their end of the agreement, we could no longer support their request to remain Unifor. And so the implications for that to think about is, let's just say Sunwing is successful in having blocking us from being an intervener, and they oppose the application, and now all of a sudden, what ends up happening is nobody is going to be there to say, yeah, they should stay with Sunwing or they should stay with Unifor. And if the ultimate goal is to stay with Unifor throughout the process, it would probably not be a very wise thing to be successful on the intervention aspect, as well as by not agreeing to support the application. In that case, what could potentially happen is that the CIRB would look at it and say, okay, we're going to merge these at this time, and there is the potential that this would just come down to a vote, and they would lose the ability for Unifor to represent them throughout their process. Now, they've been adamant about it. They like the representational model, and we're okay with that.
So let me ask this question. Why is it that they want to stay uniform? What is their drive or desire to stay as Unifor as opposed to having Alpa represent them?
Well, I can't really speculate, but what I can relay is the things that they have told us. They like the representation that Unifor provides.
And how does that differ from Alpa's?
Well, they're used to having certain staff members, certain lawyers that work for them. Now, if I'm allowed to speculate a bit, I should add a bit more color on how Alpa would work. So let's just say this was reversed, and Alpa, we have, let's say, a certain amount of money in the bank, and we leave Alpa, or we're going to leave Alpa, and we're going to join another union. We don't get to take that money with us. It is Alpa's money that has been collected from dues, and we would be leaving without any money. And I can't speculate how Unifor works, but if Unifor works the same way that Alpa works, it would mean that all of their dues money that they've collected over the years would be forfeited to Unifor on the day that they would leave.
So, Francis, what other common ground would you say that we have with Sunwing?
Well, our position is that if you were a Sunwing pilot that was hired 10 years ago, you come here and you see all of the benefits that you would have as if you were hired by WestJet 10 years ago. So obviously, our collective agreement has length of service pay. Sunwing does not. And so it is our position, it is Alpa's position, that when Sunwing pilots come under our collective agreement, they are afforded length of service pay, just like we are. Now, this has caused a bit of a division between us and the company, because the company is looking at this going, look, the Sunwing guys are getting already a big pay increase. Adding length of service is just, egregious. And so obviously we do get paid differently. And there's a certain amount of methodology. We don't just look at hourly wages. We look at everything. So for example, we look at the hourly wage rate multiplied by the minimum monthly guarantee, or the annual guarantee in Sunwing's case. We add in 10% for our WestJet savings plan, and then they have something similar, 7% that they can give. We look at the cost of vacations, right? Because that is a cost that the company is borne. The benefits, we roughly have about the same benefits. So that's a wash. There's one thing that Sunwing has as well. They have a retirement payout up to 15 weeks, between 4 and 15 weeks of their salary they get. So that all gets added in and gets costed in. So the annual cost to WestJet to put the Sunwing pilots on our collective agreement is $31.8 million.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, but when you look at it, and we deal with CASM, like cost per available seat mile, it's not really that much. Like, it's not unaffordable. Our calculation is it's only about half a cent, actually 0.49 cents per available seat mile in additional cost to the company. So, of course, pilot unions always say these CASM costs are pennies, and of course the management sees these in millions of dollars. But we do think that is a fair. That is what the contract is. The Onyx knew full well what they were getting into when they purchased Sunwing, and a rising tide lifts all boats, and the Sunwing pilots will eventually be part of our collective agreement and are to be treated as such.
So I imagine that those costs will be borne out through increases in efficiency when they come here and begin working under our contract.
Yeah, most likely. So if you talk to a Sunwing pilot, I mean, they do have a pretty attractive job. I mean, they have the opportunities to go to Europe, and they don't fly as much per month as we do. And so I would very much expect that Sunwing or Onyx and WestJet management would make sure that they're an efficient operation just like we are.
So we've touched on some of the areas of common ground. Can you speak to some of the sticking points or some of the areas that we don't possibly see eye to eye?
Yeah, so with the transition process agreement, I mean, we will insist that they are at the same level of efficiency as we are coming into the merger, so that it's a level playing field. There is also an issue with the company and Sunwing. They have some, let's be honest, they have some good things in their collective agreement, like double time for their overtime, and they would like to bring that into our collective agreement. And while we don't oppose that at all, the company has made it clear that they do not, they're spending enough money on the increases to their compensation that they feel that it's a bit of an overreach to be also asking for those sorts of things. The other thing, we do anticipate that there will be some issue with Encore. They don't think Encore should be part of it, but Encore does have, residual rights under the pilot transfer agreement. And then on our end, there are, many of us that feel that, hey, there's a lot of cadets, and you can't very well put a cadet, who went to high school with my children, at the same level as one of our first officers who has, let's say, 10,000 hours, or even an Encore captain who has 10,000 hours. So these are things that we're going to have to work through, and we are going to come to some sort of an agreement. But there are going to be things that we like about this, and there are going to be things that we don't like about it.
I'm curious as to how the communication is going with your counterpart at Sunwing.
I would say very good. I mean, we've had a number of meetings with their merger committee, and we have excellent communication. We freely exchange information, and we're both out there making sure that our pilots' best interests are represented.
Okay, this is 2024. The internet is a real thing, and information travels quickly. So myself and probably many pilots who are out there on the line, they've had occasion to read some of the communications that have come out from Sunwing. And I recall in one of those communications, there was a mention of how, we didn't understand their business model. What do you think is thought by that?
Yeah, so just to clarify, Des, that was not from their merger committee. That was from their MEC. So I just want to walk you through Sunwing's business model a bit, and just kind of fill you in, and for our pilots listening, what is their business all about? Because as you know, they are heavily seasonal, and they fluctuate season to season because they are so heavily invested in the winter flying season. So if you talk to pilots on the line, they talk about, hey, they're only bringing 18 airplanes. And then on the flip side of that, you talk to Sunwing pilots, and they're like, yeah, it's only 18 airplanes, but it's like enough flying for 42 or 43 airplanes. So you're kind of getting a discount. And both those views, in my opinion, aren't nuanced enough. And I want to walk you through some of that thing. So in this merger, we're not looking at 18 tails and limiting to that. What we are going to be looking at is block hours, and looking at ASMs, available seat miles, a common metric in the airline industry. And so this is important because these are the same metrics that Onyx, the private equity firm that owns us, is going to be looking at. And so we do a lot of modeling, and we look at how can different scenarios play out for both WestJet Pilots and Sunwing Pilots. So, and what is Onyx likely to do? Okay, we know there has to be a fundamental understanding of what private equity does. Private equity purchases companies that they think they can get a good deal on, and they drive efficiencies. And then at a certain point, they turn around and they sell that company. We've been through that. We understand that Onyx will drive efficiencies because they drove efficiencies at WestJet, and they are going to drive efficiencies at Sunwing as well. And that has to be clearly understood. So when you look back at Sunwing, they were a relatively successful tour operator. They have consistently turned a small profit until COVID, obviously. But there is an intrinsic value to Sunwing. So if you compare, let's say, Sunwing to Flair, if Flair found themselves in trouble, they would likely not find a buyer. They would end up liquidating, and that would be their end of their company because there is no residual value to the Flair business model.
They can't generate any more revenue than what they're doing in their model.
That's exactly right. Where obviously there was something that Onyx saw in Sunwing that made them attractive. So there is residual value to Sunwing. So we know that Sunwing was due for a leaf repayment this year. That was the large employer fund that the federal government put on during COVID. And so most likely they ended up needing additional outside investment, and that facilitated the sale of the company. But they have solid revenue potential. They run roughly the same amount of holiday flights from Toronto as we do. They are the market leader in both Quebec City, Ottawa, and tied with Air Transat in Montreal. So there is considerable value that they are bringing to this merger. But we do need to look more in depth and look on a more micro level at their business model when we're doing that. And what I'd like to do is run you through some of those things. So we know, based on the information that Alpa has provided for us, they have about 6.5 billion available seat miles available every year. And what makes Sunwing different than WestJet is that those seat miles are heavily concentrated in the winter months. And then in the summer months, they have considerably fewer available seat miles, considerably fewer block hours. And that's why they go on European deployments. It's kind of to average that out. So we look at that. And then we look at what happens if there's a merge and there's no change. So we add all the pilots together and we add all the seat miles and block hours together. What does that look like for a WestJet pilot schedule? And I'd like to walk you through that. So WestJet is in the business, obviously, of maximizing the efficiencies of their assets. And so what would end up happening is if they joined these block hours and joined the 515 pilots that they are bringing, is that you would end up with in, let's say, the months of December, January, February, and March, roughly having pilots fly the maximum scheduled block hours of 85 hours a month before the overtime threshold kicks in. Okay. But what that would mean is that in lower months, so let's just say May, June, September, and October, you're getting to a low of 59 hours of flying. So the pilot that is flying 85 hours in January is now going to be flying only 59 hours in September. And that's going to be across the board. So there's a considerable cost to that because you're paying a minimum monthly guarantee of 77.5 hours. So you're looking at just about 18 hours that you're paying for pilots to not work. Now, that sounds great. I mean, if that's what ends up happening, hey, this is going to be great. However, we know Onyx is not going to do that. We know WestJet is going to drive efficiencies. So the question, what we look at then after that is, so what would WestJet do to drive those efficiencies? As most likely what they would do is they would combine some routes in the winter months. they would, instead of having, let's just say, 2 flights a day or 4 flights a day to Punta Cana, which would be the amount if you added what Sunwing does and what we do, they would say, okay, we're just going to do 2 because we don't want to have that excess capacity and have these excess pilots going around in the summer. So let's just say that they end up cutting back on some of those flights. So for those busy winter months, they cut back an average of 10 hours per pilot, okay? And we'll call it normalize or equalize out the pilot staffing in order to keep it more level. What that means is it's a loss of about 28,400 block hours to balance out that month-to-month variability. So if that was the case, if we balance out that variability, what ends up happening is that 59 hours that I was talking about that we would only fly would end up coming up into the 70-hour range, which when you combine with training, maybe some excess vacation. And that is how these companies drive efficiencies. And so we are expecting that is what WestJet management will do. But what does that mean for the pilots? If they cut 29,000 or 28,400 block hours, what that means is that there could potentially be a loss of 61 pilot jobs. That's combining WestJet and Sunwing, a loss of 61 pilots. Now, that's not to say 61 pilots are going to get laid off. Not at all. But it's 61 fewer pilots that we have if they didn't do anything. And that is our concern. So if there is growth at WestJet, we want there to be growth proportional to the number of aircraft that we're getting, not proportional to the number of aircraft we're getting minus whatever it costs or whatever the company needs to do to make the airline more efficient.
So how would we do that?
Well, I mean, this is kind of one of the areas that we may end up disagreeing with the Sunwing pilots on is we went through the right sizing of our airline, and Onyx drove efficiencies really hard when they came here. And what we would see as reasonable is that Sunwing is brought to the same level of efficiency as we are before the merger. So in most mergers, what ends up happening is one group will say, hey, look, we have this many aircraft on order, and therefore our spot on the seniority list should be proportional to those additional aircraft on order. And that was the case in the FedEx and Flying Tiger merger back in, I believe, 1981. And that was the argument that FedEx made. And we're actually not making that argument. Our argument is eventually these Sunwing pilots will be WestJet pilots. And if WestJet is going to grow in 3 years or so, these WestJet pilots who came from Sunwing should see an equal amount of growth and benefit as we do. However, what we can't have is excess Sunwing pilots soaking up these positions, and because they're not quite as efficient as we are yet, our upgrades slow down or our flow stops from Encore because they are soaking up those excess positions.
So the idea is to equalize efficiencies between the two companies, and then once they're both equalized, merge those operations at that point, as opposed to have an unbalanced operation merging into a balanced operation.
I think that's a very reasonable thing. And then going forward, both groups can reap the benefits of the growth at WestJet.
Okay, Francis, thank you very much. That is obviously a lot of information there. All appreciated. It's good information, and the objective of these podcasts is to make sure that you, our pilots, have that information. It's going to take some time to filter through that and gain a complete understanding, but certainly use the DART system, ask lots of questions, feed in your questions, and we will endeavor to get them all answered for you as we move through this process.
Des, it was an honor to be here. Thanks so much. We are going to keep the pilot group appraised of everything that's happening. And I know this was a pretty dense conversation, but we're trying to give all the information out that we can.
So that brings this edition of PIREPs to a wrap. Before we go, we do want to just touch again on the fact that, it's been a bit of a difficult time here at the association. Of course, we have lost one of our dear friends. This episode is, in fact, being recorded the day after the memorial. It was a good day. It was a good send-off for an excellent person. It was really good to see the turnout and the number of pilots there and the fraternity and the community that we have as a group of pilots. Christina would have been proud for sure. The work continues, though, as she would want. We will continue to do the things that are necessary to move this pilot group forward and advance the profession, as she would say.